A world on the brink, when power ruled over humanity. The world did not fall into chaos overnight. It fractured slowly, like stone under centuries of pressure, until the final crack echoed across nations and empires alike. The age in which this story begins was one of towering ambition and fragile peace, an era where crowns weighed heavier than conscience, and power mattered more than human life. It was the late era of the great empires, a time historians would later call the Age of Command. Vast territories were ruled not by unity or shared humanity, but by borders drawn in blood and ink. Empires stretched across continents, their flags planted deep into foreign soil, their laws enforced by steel and fear. Kings, emperors, and councils sat in marble halls, far removed from the dust and suffering of the people whose lives they controlled. The world's balance rested on uneasy alliances. Treaties were signed with trembling hands and broken with confident smiles. Diplomacy existed, but only as a performance, an elegant mask hiding sharpened blades. Every empire claimed it stood for order, civilization, and progress, yet beneath the grand speeches and monumental architecture lay a simpler truth: power ruled over humanity. At the heart of these empires stood cities of unimaginable wealth. Their streets glittered with gold, their markets overflowed with goods brought from distant lands. Scholars debated philosophy, generals planned conquest, and nobles discussed the fate of millions over lavish banquets. To the rulers, the world was a board of strategy. Lands were pieces, armies were numbers, and people were expendable. Far from these centers of power, reality looked very different. Villages lived under the shadow of imperial ambition. Farmers worked land they did not own, paying taxes that grew heavier each year to fund wars they would never understand. Young men were taken from their homes to serve as soldiers, often returning broken or not at all. Mothers learned to recognize the sound of marching boots as a warning, not a promise of protection. Fear became a language everyone understood. The rise of these empires had not been accidental. They were built on the belief that strength justified rule. Conquest was framed as destiny. Expansion was called security. Resistance was labeled rebellion. Over time, the idea of dominance became so normalized that few questioned it openly. Those who did often disappeared into prisons, exiles, or shallow graves forgotten by history. Yet beneath the surface of obedience, something restless began to stir. The world itself seemed to sense the coming storm. Trade routes grew tense as merchants whispered of military buildups. Border towns reported skirmishes dismissed by officials as minor incidents. Spies moved through capitals disguised as diplomats and scholars. Information became as valuable as weapons, and lies traveled faster than truth. The empires were watching each other closely, too closely. Each ruler feared being the first to appear weak. Any sign of compromise was seen as vulnerability. Any delay in military expansion was interpreted as decline. Power had become a fragile thing, constantly demanding proof of its existence. To maintain it, leaders believed they had to dominate harder, strike faster, and silence dissent more brutally than before. In the halls of command, maps covered entire walls. Generals traced borders with gloved fingers, discussing invasion routes as if describing a game. They spoke of casualties in abstract terms, acceptable losses, necessary sacrifices. Human lives were reduced to statistics meant to justify ambition. No one asked who paid the true price. As tensions escalated, ordinary people felt the change long before war was officially declared. Food became scarce as supplies were redirected to armies. Prices rose, curfews were enforced, soldiers appeared in greater numbers, their presence both reassuring and terrifying. The promise of protection came with the reality of control. Religion, culture, and identity were weaponized. Empires claimed moral superiority, portraying their enemies as barbaric threats to civilization itself. Propaganda filled streets and homes, shaping minds before shaping battlefields. Children grew up learning to hate nations they had never seen. Still, hope lingered in quiet places. In secret gatherings, in whispered conversations, people spoke of peace not as a treaty, but as a return to dignity. Scholars warned that unchecked power always devoured itself. Veterans questioned whether loyalty to empire was worth the endless cycle of bloodshed. These voices were small, often silenced, but they existed. History, however, rarely listens to whispers. The final months before the great conflict were marked by a tense stillness, like the breath held before a scream. Borders were reinforced, armies mobilized, diplomats met urgently, knowing their words no longer carried weight. Everyone sensed that the world stood on the edge of something irreversible. Then came the moment that shattered illusion. A single incident, small enough to be dismissed, yet significant enough to ignite outrage, occurred at a contested border. Each empire blamed the other, each demanded justice defined by dominance. Within days, ultimatums were issued. Within weeks, alliances were activated. And within moments, the fragile peace that had held the world together collapsed entirely. When the first official declaration of war was announced, it was framed as necessity. Leaders spoke of defense, honor, and survival. Crowds cheered, convinced they were witnessing strength. But beneath the celebration lay a darker truth. Humanity had once again been overruled by power. The war that followed would reshape continents, erase cultures, and scar generations. It would produce heroes and villains, victories and tragedies, but at its core, it would remain a consequence of choices made by those who valued control over compassion. The rise of a reluctant hero from the shadows. History rarely announces its heroes. They do not arrive with banners or titles, nor are they born into destiny, as legends would suggest. More often, they emerge quietly, shaped by hardship, hidden by obscurity, and driven not by ambition, but by necessity. Such was the beginning of Elias Mercer. Elias was born far from the grand capitals of empire, in a forgotten border settlement where maps faded into uncertainty. His village sat between contested lands, claimed by no empire with conviction, yet exploited by all. It was a place where children learned early that survival mattered more than dreams, and silence was often safer than truth. His father was a blacksmith, a man whose hands bore the marks of honest labor and quiet endurance. His mother kept the household together, with patience forged through loss. They did not speak of politics or power. In their world, empires were distant forces, felt only through rising taxes, conscription orders, and the distant thunder of marching armies. From an early age, Elias learned to observe rather than speak. He watched soldiers pass through the village, their armor gleaming while their eyes remained hollow. He noticed how authority changed people, how men who arrived disciplined and orderly often left cruel and indifferent. Power, he realized, did not always corrupt instantly. Sometimes it eroded slowly, like rust beneath polished steel. When Elias was 12, the war found his home. It did not arrive as a battle, but as an order. A decree from a distant capital demanded resources and recruits. His father was taken to repair weapons for the Imperial forces. Weeks later, his body was returned without explanation. No apology followed. No compensation was offered. The Empire simply moved on. That was the moment something within Elias hardened, not into hatred, but into understanding. He understood that power was not personal. It did not care who suffered, only that obedience was maintained. And in that realization, his childhood quietly ended. As years passed, Elias became skilled with his hands, like his father before him. He repaired tools, weapons, and eventually learned to read and write from a traveling scholar who passed through the village. Knowledge, Elias discovered, was its own form of resistance. The more he learned, the more he saw the patterns repeating across history. Empires rising, justifying their rule, and collapsing under the weight of their own arrogance. Yet Elias did not seek rebellion. He had no desire to lead, no dream of changing the world. His ambitions were modest: to protect his family, to live without chains, and to remain invisible to those who ruled. Fate, however, had other plans. When Imperial forces tightened their grip on the borderlands, Elias was conscripted into service. Refusal meant execution. Compliance meant survival, at least temporarily. He chose survival, though the choice haunted him. Training camps stripped recruits of identity. Names were replaced with numbers. Morality was replaced with obedience. Elias learned quickly, not because he embraced violence, but because he understood the cost of failure. He became known for his discipline and restraint, a soldier who followed orders without cruelty. It was his reluctance that set him apart. On the battlefield, Elias fought not with rage, but with precision. He avoided unnecessary bloodshed whenever possible, pulling wounded enemies to safety when no one was watching. These acts went unnoticed by commanders, but not by fellow soldiers. Quiet respect followed him, though he never sought it. Inside, he was divided. Each victory felt like a betrayal of the boy he once was. Each loss reminded him of his father. He questioned whether survival within the system made him complicit in its cruelty. At night, sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of fire, shouting, and faces he could not forget. The turning point came during a skirmish along a contested river. Elias's unit was ordered to burn a village suspected of harboring resistance fighters. The order was clear. The consequences of disobedience were clearer. When they arrived, Elias saw not enemies, but families, people who looked like his own. Children clung to their mothers. Elders stood silently, already resigned to their fate. In that moment, the distance between empire and humanity collapsed entirely. Elias refused. He lowered his weapon and stood between his unit and the village. Chaos followed. Shouts echoed. Guns were raised, not at the villagers, but at him. Yet something unexpected happened. One by one, other soldiers hesitated. Some lowered their weapons, others stepped back. The village was spared. Elias was arrested. Imprisonment was meant to break him. Instead, it revealed his influence. Word of his defiance spread quietly through the ranks. To some, he became a traitor. To others, a symbol, proof that obedience was a choice, not a law of nature. Rather than execute him, the Empire reassigned Elias to a remote intelligence unit. They believed isolating him would erase his impact. They were wrong. In the shadows, Elias learned how the Empire truly functioned, its secrets, its fears, its internal fractures. He saw how close it already was to collapse, held together only by the illusion of absolute control. He did not plan to become a leader. He did not seek power. But history, relentless and indifferent, began to move around him. People started listening. What made Elias dangerous was not his strength, but his conscience. In a world ruled by force, his refusal to surrender his humanity became a revolutionary act. And so, from the shadows of empire, a reluctant hero began to rise, not to claim a throne, but to challenge the very idea that power should rule over people at all.
Secrets of the Throne. Betrayal within the Empire. Empires did not collapse from the strength of their enemies alone. More often, they rotted from within, eaten away by ambition, fear, and betrayal long before the first walls were breached. While soldiers bled on distant battlefields, a quieter and far more dangerous war was being fought inside the imperial palace. The capital stood as a monument to dominance. Towering spires of white stone pierced the sky, their shadows stretching across the city like silent warnings. From the outside, the palace symbolized order and permanence. Inside, it was a labyrinth of whispered lies and sharpened intentions. At the center of this maze sat Emperor Aldrich IV, a ruler praised publicly for strength and stability. His portraits showed a composed man with steady eyes, draped in regal authority. Yet behind closed doors, the emperor was aging, weary, and increasingly uncertain. Power, he had learned too late, demanded constant vigilance, and vigilance bred paranoia. The throne room echoed with ceremony, but real decisions were made elsewhere, in private chambers, dim corridors, and secret councils convened long after midnight. Ministers smiled during public assemblies, only to undermine one another by dawn. Loyalty was declared loudly and practiced rarely. Among the most influential figures was Chancellor Veranius, a man whose calm demeanor concealed ruthless calculation. He controlled the flow of information, deciding which truths reached the emperor and which were buried beneath convenient falsehoods. To Veranius, the empire was not a nation, it was an equation, and he intended to solve it in his favor. Opposing him quietly was General Cassian Holt, commander of the Central Legions. Holt believed in order, not ideology. He had seen too many wars begun by men who would never fight them. Though loyal to the empire, his loyalty did not extend blindly to the throne. This made him dangerous. Between these two forces lay the emperor himself, trapped by the very power he wielded. As the war beyond the capital intensified, so did the struggle within. Reports from the front were altered before reaching the throne. Victories were exaggerated, defeats were disguised as strategic withdrawals. The truth, when inconvenient, was labeled treason. It was during this time that rumors began to circulate, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Entire battalions missing, funds diverted, orders issued without imperial seal. Someone within the palace was reshaping the empire from the shadows. The people, unaware of these inner fractures, continued to suffer. Taxes increased to fund campaigns that existed only on parchment. Families were told their sons died as heroes, even when records showed they had been sacrificed to cover political mistakes. The empire's image remained intact, but its foundation was cracking. Into this web of deception entered a name spoken reluctantly in council chambers, Elias Mercer. Intelligence reports described him as a soldier with influence, a man whose refusal to obey an unlawful order had inspired hesitation among the ranks. To some advisors, he was a threat, to others, a tool waiting to be used. Chancellor Veranius saw opportunity. He proposed a strategy that appeared brilliant on the surface, using dissenters like Elias as proof of the empire's moral strength. Controlled opposition, he argued, would strengthen public trust.
In reality, Varanius intended to draw these figures into the open, where they could be neutralized quietly. General Holt disagreed. He warned that silencing voices like Elias would fracture the army further. Soldiers trusted men who shared their suffering, not officials who hid behind walls. His warnings were dismissed as sentimentality. The emperor listened, said nothing, and approved Varanius's plan. Behind this decision lay a deeper betrayal. Unknown to the throne, Varanius had been negotiating with rival powers for months. His goal was not victory, but survival, his own. Should the empire fall, he intended to emerge indispensable to whoever rose next. Allegiance to him was a currency meant to be traded. Messages were sent through coded channels, borders were deliberately weakened, key defenses were reassigned under false pretenses. Each act was small enough to escape notice, but together they formed a pattern of calculated sabotage. The palace guards, once symbols of honor, became instruments of silence. Servants disappeared, scribes altered records, historians were instructed on what could and could not be written. History itself was being reshaped in real time. General Holt began his own investigation. He followed missing orders, traced diverted funds, and uncovered inconsistencies that pointed directly to the Chancellor's office. But proof alone was not enough. To accuse Varanius without undeniable evidence would mean execution. Trust had become a weapon, and everyone feared using it. Meanwhile, the emperor's health declined. Poison was suspected, then dismissed. Stress was blamed. The truth was never confirmed. In his weakened state, Aldrich relied heavily on Varanius, unaware that his most trusted advisor was guiding the empire to ruin. As cracks widened, resistance groups within the capital began to organize. Scholars, former officials, and disillusioned soldiers shared information in secret. They spoke not of overthrow, but of exposure. The empire, they believed, might still be saved if the truth reached the people. Elias Mercer's name surfaced again. From the shadows, messages reached him, revealing fragments of the palace's corruption. For the first time, Elias understood that the war was not just being fought on battlefields, but in ink, whispers, and betrayal. The enemy was not only beyond the borders, it sat on the throne's steps.
The first blood, when diplomacy failed. War did not begin with the clash of swords or the roar of cannons. It began in silence, inside rooms where voices were calm, words were chosen carefully, and the fate of millions rested on fragile promises. The final attempt at peace took place in a neutral city, chosen precisely because it belonged to no empire strong enough to dominate the others. Delegates arrived under banners of diplomacy, escorted by soldiers who pretended not to prepare for war. The streets were filled with guarded optimism. People wanted to believe that reason would prevail. Inside the grand hall, representatives spoke of unity, stability, and shared interests. They exchanged formal greetings and polite smiles. Yet beneath the polished language lay suspicion hardened by years of betrayal. No one trusted the other side to honor any agreement beyond convenience. Elias Mercer was not present at the negotiations, but he followed every report closely. From the shadows, he understood what the diplomats could not or would not admit. The empires had already chosen war. The talks were not meant to prevent conflict, only to delay it long enough to appear righteous. The first fracture came quietly. A proposal was introduced to withdraw troops from contested borders. On paper, it was reasonable. In reality, it demanded sacrifice from one side while allowing the other to maintain strategic advantage. The imbalance was obvious. Objections were raised. Tempers flared behind closed doors. Accusations replaced cooperation.
Then came the lie. A messenger arrived with news of an alleged attack. An Imperial patrol destroyed near the border. Civilians reportedly killed. Evidence was unclear. Witnesses contradicted one another. But outrage spread faster than truth ever could. One empire accused the other of treachery. The accused denied responsibility. Trust, already fragile, shattered completely. The negotiations collapsed within hours. Delegates departed under heavy guard, no longer diplomats, but potential enemies. That same night, orders were sent across continents. Armies that had waited patiently now began to move. Supply lines activated. War drums echoed through fortresses and frontier towns alike. The official declaration came at dawn. It was delivered with ceremony, framed as an act of defense. Leaders spoke of honor, necessity, and survival. They promised swift victory and lasting peace. Flags were raised, bells rang, crowds gathered, cheering words they barely understood. But while leaders spoke of glory, ordinary people felt only fear. In border villages, families awoke to the sound of marching boots. Homes were searched, fields were seized for military use, livestock was taken without compensation, fathers were conscripted, sons volunteered, convinced by speeches they would not live long enough to question. Mothers packed bags with trembling hands. Elias witnessed the first bloodshed, not as a soldier, but as a bystander forced to act. A transport convoy carrying refugees was mistaken or labeled as enemy movement. The order to fire was given without hesitation. When the smoke cleared, the road was littered with bodies that wore no uniform. There were no strategic gains that day, only silence and regret. News of the incident spread, distorted and reshaped to serve political narratives. The dead were declared enemies. The attack was called a victory. Truth became irrelevant once blood had been spilled. As battles erupted along the borders, cities far from the front felt the war in quieter, crueler ways. Food shortages appeared almost overnight. Prices doubled, then tripled. Ration lines stretched for blocks. The poor starved first. Curfews were enforced. Dissent was criminalized. Newspapers printed what they were told or ceased publication entirely. Citizens were encouraged to report unpatriotic behavior. Fear turned neighbors into informants. Children stopped attending school. Instead, they learned to identify aircraft by sound, to hide during air raids, to accept loss before they could understand it. War became their normal. On the battlefield, the illusion of honor vanished quickly. Soldiers advanced through mud soaked with rain and blood, following orders that made little sense on the ground. Communication failed. Reinforcements never arrived. Medics worked until exhaustion, then continued anyway. Survival became a matter of chance rather than courage. Elias moved through this chaos reluctantly but decisively. He did not fight for empire or ideology. He fought to protect those beside him, to reduce suffering where possible. Each act of mercy felt like a rebellion. Each refusal to dehumanize the enemy marked him further as dangerous to those who thrived on obedience. The first major confrontation occurred near the River Haldon, a strategic crossing long disputed by rival empires. Both sides claimed it as essential. Neither was willing to retreat. The battle lasted 3 days. When it ended, the river ran dark with blood. Thousands were dead. No decisive victory was claimed. Maps were redrawn slightly, then declared irrelevant as the war expanded beyond control. For the people living nearby, there was no victory at all. Their homes were destroyed, their land poisoned. Survivors fled with nothing but memory and grief. The empire promised rebuilding. No one believed it. Back in the capital,
Officials praised the necessary sacrifice. They spoke of momentum and morale. Behind closed doors, panic spread. The war was larger, bloodier, and far less predictable than expected. General Holt warned the throne that morale was collapsing. Chancellor Veranius dismissed the reports, presenting fabricated successes instead. The emperor, weakened and isolated, approved continued escalation. Diplomacy was no longer an option. It had failed not because words were insufficient, but because truth had already been abandoned. Elias understood then that the war's greatest danger was not its violence, but its justification. Once blood was spilled, every side found reasons to continue. Ending the conflict would require something rarer than victory. It would require honesty, and honesty was the first casualty of war. The world had crossed a threshold it could not return from. The first blood had been drawn, not just from bodies, but from the very idea that peace was possible through power alone.
March of the Forgotten, Soldiers Without Glory. History remembers its wars through the names of generals, the dates of decisive battles, and the borders drawn afterward. It rarely remembers the men who carried the weight of those wars on their backs. The forgotten soldiers, those without medals, without monuments, without even graves, were the true foundation upon which empires stood and fell. They came from farms, factories, fishing towns, and city streets. Some volunteered out of belief. Others were drafted without choice. Most had never traveled beyond their hometowns before being handed a uniform and a weapon. Overnight, they were transformed from citizens into soldiers, expected to fight for causes they barely understood. Their training was brief and unforgiving. There was no time for philosophy or doubt. Commands replaced conversation. Fear became routine. They learned how to march, how to shoot, how to obey, and how not to ask questions. The empire did not require them to think. It required them to endure. Elias Mercer walked among them, not as a leader above, but as one among many. His rank meant little in the trenches. Here, titles dissolved into survival. Men were judged not by loyalty to the throne, but by whether they shared water, carried the wounded, or stood firm when chaos erupted. The marches were endless. Columns of soldiers moved through shattered landscapes, fields burned black, villages reduced to rubble, roads lined with the remnants of civilian life. The sound of boots became a constant rhythm, echoing through valleys and broken towns alike. Hunger gnawed at their bodies. Exhaustion hollowed their eyes. At night, they spoke of home. Some talked about children they had left behind, unsure if they would be remembered as heroes or strangers. Others confessed regrets they had never shared aloud before. A few remained silent, already withdrawing into themselves, preparing for an end they felt approaching. These men did not dream of victory. They dreamed of survival. On the battlefield, glory was a myth that died quickly. There were no heroic charges, no clear victories, only confusion, noise, and terror. Orders arrived late or not at all. Friendly fire was as deadly as the enemy. The wounded cried out until they could no longer be heard. When soldiers fell, they were rarely named. Bodies were buried hastily, if at all. Markers were lost to rain and shelling. Records were incomplete or destroyed. Families would later receive letters filled with vague phrases, missing in action, presumed dead. Closure was a luxury few received. Elias watched men vanish from existence. One morning, a soldier marched beside him. By evening, his place in the formation was empty. No announcement followed. The march continued. War did not pause for grief. Yet within this machinery of destruction, humanity persisted in small, defiant ways. Soldiers shared food meant for one. They told jokes to break the silence before battle. They risked punishment to help civilians escape advancing fronts. These moments did not win wars, they preserved souls. The Empire's propaganda painted these soldiers as heroes, symbols of unity and strength. Posters showed clean uniforms and confident faces. Speeches praised sacrifice and honor. But the men who lived the war knew the truth. They were expendable. Supplies ran out frequently. Medical care was overwhelmed. Replacements arrived unprepared and frightened. Commanders measured success in territory gained, not lives lost. The forgotten soldiers were treated as a resource, used until depleted, then replaced. Elias struggled with the weight of it. Each march felt like a procession toward erasure. He questioned whether surviving made him complicit in the system that consumed others so carelessly. Yet leaving would mean abandoning those he depended on. So he stayed, walking beside the forgotten, carrying what burdens he could. The turning point came during an assault that was doomed from the start. Intelligence had failed. The enemy's defenses were stronger than reported. The order to advance was given anyway. Retreat was not permitted. The result was slaughter. Men fell by the hundreds. Medics were overwhelmed. Communications collapsed. When the attack was finally called off, the battlefield was silent except for the wounded left behind. Elias disobeyed orders and stayed. With a small group, he dragged the injured to safety under cover of darkness. They carried men whose names they did not know, whose families they would never meet. It was an act without recognition, one that would never appear in official records. But those men lived. In the days that followed, rumors spread quietly among the ranks, not of victory, but of mercy. Elias's actions became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of dignity. Soldiers began to trust him, not because he promised change, but because he refused to forget them. The Empire continued its advance, indifferent to the cost, but something subtle had shifted. The forgotten soldiers were no longer entirely invisible. They had found solidarity in one another. War would continue to claim their lives. History would still fail to record their names, but for a brief moment, amid the devastation, they reclaimed their humanity. Years later, monuments would be built, speeches would be given, dates would be remembered. Yet the true legacy of the war would live elsewhere, in the unmarked graves, in the families who waited, and in the memory of those who marched without glory.
A nation divided, hope, fear, and resistance. The war did not only divide borders, it divided people. As armies clashed on distant fronts, a quieter conflict unfolded within the nation itself, tearing apart communities, families, and beliefs. The empire projected unity to the outside world, but inside its cities and towns, fractures widened with every passing day. At first, the signs were subtle. Whispers replaced open conversation. Neighbors avoided one another's eyes. Flags hung from windows, not as symbols of pride, but as declarations of survival. To display loyalty was to ensure safety. To question was to invite suspicion. The government spoke endlessly of unity, yet fear became the language most citizens understood. In the capital, ration lines stretched for blocks. The wealthy found ways around shortages, the poor did not. Factories shifted entirely to wartime production, forcing workers into exhausting schedules under constant supervision. Strikes were forbidden. Dissent was labeled treason. Still, hope refused to disappear. In small apartments and hidden basements, people gathered quietly. They shared food, information, and something more dangerous, ideas. They spoke of freedom not as rebellion, but as dignity.
They remembered a time before fear ruled daily life and wondered if it could return. The nation was no longer simply divided between empire and enemy. It was divided between obedience and conscience. Elias Mercer became a name spoken carefully, often in hushed tones. To the government, he was a problem, a soldier whose influence could not be fully controlled. To ordinary people, he represented possibility, not victory, but resistance rooted in humanity. Resistance did not always look like violence. Teachers continued educating children in secret after schools were repurposed for military use. Journalists circulated underground papers, handwritten and passed from person to person. Artists painted symbols of hope on crumbling walls, knowing they would be erased by morning. These acts were small, but together they formed a quiet defiance that the empire struggled to suppress. Fear, however, remained constant. Informants were everywhere. Families were torn apart by accusations. A careless word could lead to arrest. Prisons filled with citizens whose only crime was doubt. The government insisted these measures were temporary. Few believed that anymore. In rural regions, resistance took a different form. Villages cut off from supply routes learned to rely on one another. Farmers hid grain from military collectors. Entire communities worked together to mislead patrols, protecting deserters and refugees. These people did not see themselves as revolutionaries. They saw themselves as human beings refusing to be erased. The empire responded with force. Curfews tightened, raids increased, punishments became public. The goal was not justice, but example. Fear, the rulers believed, would restore unity. Instead, it deepened division. Elias found himself pulled into this growing internal conflict despite his efforts to remain focused on the front. Messages reached him through broken channels, stories of civilians punished, of resistance crushed, of courage ignored. Each report weighed on him heavier than any battlefield loss. He understood something the empire refused to accept. Loyalty cannot be commanded, it must be earned. Within the military, cracks formed as well. Soldiers questioned orders that targeted civilians. Some refused, others deserted. Entire units became unreliable, not because they lacked discipline, but because they retained empathy. Commanders responded with stricter enforcement. Executions were carried out to maintain order. The effect was devastating. Morale collapsed. Fear replaced trust. Yet even in the darkest moments, hope persisted. In one city, a group of women organized relief for displaced families, defying curfews to deliver food and medicine. In another, factory workers sabotaged faulty equipment to prevent weapons from reaching the front. Each act carried risk. Each act mattered. The resistance had no single leader, no unified ideology. It was born not from ambition, but from exhaustion. People were tired of being told their suffering was necessary. Elias became a bridge between worlds, soldier and civilian, obedience and defiance. He refused calls to declare himself a leader. Instead, he listened. He connected groups without commanding them. His strength lay not in authority, but in trust. The empire labeled him a traitor. Propaganda campaigns painted resistance as chaos, freedom as weakness. The nation was warned that without absolute control, collapse was inevitable. Many believed it. Fear is persuasive. But so is hope. As the war dragged on, it became clear that victory abroad meant little if the nation collapsed within. Cities burned not from enemy attacks, but from internal unrest. Families fled not foreign armies, but their own government. The nation stood at a crossroads. One path led deeper into control, violence, and silence. The other led into uncertainty, risk, resistance, and the possibility of change. Neither path promised safety, but only one promised dignity. History often portrays resistance as inevitable, but those who lived it knew the truth. It required courage every single day. Courage to speak, to help, to refuse. Courage to hope when hope felt dangerous. For Elias and countless others, the struggle was no longer about empire or war. It was about the right to exist without fear, to choose compassion over obedience, to believe that a nation belonged to its people, not its rulers.
The turning point, a battle that history tried to forget. History is selective. It remembers victories that flatter power and forgets moments that expose its fragility. Some battles are erased not because they were insignificant, but because they revealed truths too dangerous to preserve. The Battle of Greyhaven was one such moment, a turning point buried beneath silence. Greyhaven was not meant to matter. It was a narrow valley between two ridgelines, strategically inconvenient and politically unimportant. No capital lay beyond it, no throne depended on its control. That was precisely why it was chosen. High Command believed a limited engagement there could distract the enemy while larger operations unfolded elsewhere. They were wrong. Elias Mercer arrived at Greyhaven with a unit already exhausted by months of marching and half-truths. Supplies were low, reinforcements were uncertain. Intelligence reports contradicted one another, yet the order was clear: hold the valley at all costs. No one explained why. The valley itself felt ominous. Fog clung to the ground, even at midday, muting sound and swallowing distance. Broken remnants of old settlements dotted the landscape, stone walls overtaken by vines, abandoned wells, rusted tools left behind by people who had fled long before the war arrived. It was a place history had already forgotten once. As night fell, Elias sensed something was wrong. Scouts reported enemy movement far heavier than expected. Artillery positions were being established on the ridgelines. Communication with Central Command was erratic, then cut entirely. The valley had become isolated. By dawn, they were surrounded. The first shots rang out without warning, sharp and disorienting. The fog amplified confusion, turning every sound into a threat. Soldiers fired blindly at shadows. Orders were shouted, repeated, then lost entirely. The battle did not begin with strategy. It erupted into chaos. Elias moved instinctively, pulling men into defensive positions, urging restraint where panic threatened to take over. There was no glory here, only survival. Wave after wave pressed in. The enemy's numbers were overwhelming, far beyond what intelligence had predicted. It became clear that Greyhaven was not a distraction, it was a trap. Someone knew. Someone had allowed this unit to be sacrificed. As hours passed, the valley turned into a killing ground. Ammunition dwindled. Medics worked until their hands shook uncontrollably. The wounded were stacked behind shattered stone walls, some begging to be left behind so others could fight. Elias refused. He fought not as a commander issuing distant orders, but as a presence, visible, relentless, human. When morale faltered, he stood where fear was greatest. When lines broke, he filled the gaps. His voice carried not authority, but certainty. If they were to die, it would not be in silence. Midday brought the heaviest assault. Artillery fire rained down, tearing the valley apart. The fog lifted briefly, revealing the scale of the encirclement. For the first time, the soldiers understood the truth. This was meant to erase them.
The realization ignited something fierce. Men who had marched without purpose now fought with clarity, not for empire, not for medals, but for each other, for the idea that their lives would not be discarded without resistance. Elias saw an opportunity the enemy had missed. The eastern ridgeline, assumed secure, had been overextended. The terrain there was unstable, the fog concealing narrow paths known only to locals long gone. Elias gathered volunteers, men who understood the risk and accepted it without hesitation. They moved silently, climbing through debris and shadow. The ascent was brutal. Rocks gave way. Enemy patrols passed within arm's reach. One misstep would have meant annihilation. Yet they climbed, driven by the certainty that failure meant extinction. At the summit, they struck. The attack was swift and precise. Artillery crews unprepared for resistance from below were overwhelmed. Guns were disabled. Signals flared, not to call for rescue, but to mark defiance. The explosion echoed through the valley. Below, the trapped unit saw the signal and surged forward with renewed force. The enemy, caught between resistance they had not anticipated, faltered. Confusion spread. Momentum shifted. For the first time since dawn, the valley breathed. The fighting continued until nightfall. When it ended, Greyhaven was unrecognizable. Bodies lay everywhere, friend and foe alike, indistinguishable in death. The surviving soldiers stood in stunned silence, too exhausted to celebrate. They had held the valley. But victory came at a cost no report would ever record. More than half the unit was gone. Many of the wounded would not survive transport. And perhaps most damning of all, no reinforcements arrived, no acknowledgement followed. Greyhaven was never mentioned in official briefings. Orders came swiftly afterwards. The survivors were reassigned. Records were altered. Casualty numbers were reduced. The battle was reclassified as a minor skirmish. Those who asked questions were warned, then silenced. History moved on. But those who lived through Greyhaven never forgot. For Elias, the truth was devastating. The battle had proven what he had long suspected. The Empire was willing to erase entire units to protect its image. Greyhaven was not forgotten by accident. It was buried by design. Yet its impact rippled outward. The enemy, shaken by unexpected resistance, delayed their advance. Strategic plans were altered. Time was gained. Time that allowed resistance within the nation to organize, to survive. Greyhaven, though erased from books, changed the course of the war. Among soldiers, the story spread quietly, not as legend, but as warning. Trust the men beside you, not the words from above. Loyalty belonged to people, not power. Elias emerged from the valley changed. He carried the dead with him, every step a reminder of what truth cost in a world built on lies. He did not speak of heroism, he spoke of responsibility. History tried to forget Greyhaven because it revealed something undeniable. Empires are weakest when ordinary people refuse to be expendable. The battle would never have a monument, no day of remembrance, no speeches. But in the quiet defiance it inspired, in the resistance it strengthened, Greyhaven endured. The fall of power and the cost of victory. Victory arrived without celebration. There were no parades that felt sincere, no speeches that rang true. When the war finally began to slow, when borders stopped shifting and cannons fell silent, the world did not exhale in relief. It merely stood still, stunned by the weight of what had been lost. The Empire declared success. Official statements spoke of secured territories, neutralized threats, and restored order. Flags were raised once more over government buildings. The throne remained intact, though weakened. On parchment, the empire had survived. In reality, it was already falling apart. The cost of victory was written everywhere, in shattered cities, in empty homes, in the faces of those who returned. Soldiers marched back through streets that no longer recognized them. They were greeted not with cheers, but with silence. People did not know how to speak to those who carried war in their eyes. Elias Mercer returned changed. He had survived Greyhaven, the marches, the bloodshed. Yet survival felt like a burden rather than a reward. The men who had walked beside him were gone, some buried, some erased, some alive but broken beyond recognition. The war had ended, but it had not released him. Across the nation, the illusion of power began to crack openly. The emperor, once distant and absolute, was now a shadow, rarely seen, often rumored to be ill or manipulated. Advisors who had guided the war quietly disappeared, reassigned or executed under the guise of restructuring. Chancellor Veranius was among them. His betrayal, long hidden, finally surfaced through leaks, testimonies, and the quiet courage of those who refused to stay silent any longer. When his crimes were exposed, the empire acted swiftly, not out of justice, but necessity. It was condemned publicly, portrayed as a lone traitor whose actions did not reflect the throne. It was a lie everyone recognized. Removing Veranius did not cleanse the empire. It merely confirmed what many had already believed. Power protected itself until it could no longer do so. General Holt resigned shortly after. He offered no speech, no defense. In his departure letter, he wrote only one line that would later circulate widely. "We won the war and lost ourselves." The nation struggled to understand what victory meant. Factories closed as wartime demand vanished overnight. Workers were dismissed without support. Veterans flooded cities seeking employment, many unable to adapt to peace. Trauma went untreated. Grief went unspoken. Families reunited awkwardly. Children met fathers they barely remembered. Spouses lived beside strangers shaped by violence. Love existed, but it was strained by memories that refused to fade. Nightmares replaced gunfire, but sleep remained elusive. Elias visited the families of fallen soldiers when he could. There were no official instructions to do so. He went because he felt responsible. He brought no speeches, no excuses, only names, stories, truth. Some families thanked him, others wept. A few turned him away, unable to forgive a war that had taken everything. He accepted all of it. In the capital, unrest grew louder. Citizens demanded accountability, reform, truth. The government responded cautiously, offering commissions and promises. Too little, too late. Trust once broken does not return easily. Power began to shift, not through revolution, but erosion. Local councils asserted autonomy. Military loyalty fractured. Laws passed quickly during wartime were challenged openly. The empire still existed, but its authority was no longer unquestioned. Victory had revealed its hollowness. Elias was offered a position within the new military structure, recognition for his service, influence in shaping the future. He refused. Power had taken enough from him. He would not allow it to take his purpose as well. Instead, he chose to speak, not as a leader demanding allegiance, but as a witness. He told the truth about Greyhaven, about forgotten soldiers, about orders that sacrificed lives to preserve appearances. His words spread not through official channels, but through people, shared, repeated, remembered. The government tolerated him at first, then feared him. But the nation was changing. Silencing him now would confirm everything he had said. Victory, Elias learned, was not the end of suffering. It was the moment when pain could no longer be justified by necessity, when excuses failed, when the reckoning began. The empire's power diminished not because it lost the war, but because it won it at too great a cost. Monuments were built for the fallen. They were beautiful and hollow. Names were carved into stone, but too many were missing. Too many lives reduced to numbers that no memorial could restore. The true scars were invisible. They lived in the quiet hesitation before trust, in the way people flinched at sudden noises, in the silence that followed the question, was it worth it? No one answered. Elias stood one evening at the edge of the capital, watching the city lights flicker against the dark. This was what they had fought to protect, he was told, a nation intact, a throne standing. But he knew better. They had fought for each other, and even that had come at an unbearable price. The fall of power did not come with flames or collapse. It came with understanding, with the realization that authority without humanity was empty, and victory without healing was meaningless. Echoes through time. Lies, legends, and lost truths. History does not speak. It is spoken for. Long after the cannons fell silent and the empire's banners were lowered, a different kind of battle began. One fought with words, memory, and omission. This war left no visible ruins, yet its consequences were just as enduring. It was the struggle over how the past would be remembered. In the years following the conflict, scholars gathered in rebuilt halls, surrounded by salvaged documents and carefully preserved accounts. They were tasked with recording what had happened, an impossible assignment disguised as duty. Too many voices had been silenced. Too many truths contradicted one another. Too much had been lost. The official histories emerged slowly. They spoke of decisive victories and necessary sacrifices. They framed the empire's actions as tragic but justified. Failures were attributed to circumstance. Betrayals were isolated to individuals already condemned. Entire battles, like Greyhaven, were reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. It was a clean narrative, and it was incomplete. Elias Mercer read these early accounts with quiet disbelief. The war he recognized, the fear, the doubt, the moral fractures, barely existed on the page. The fallen soldiers he had marched beside were statistics, stripped of names and faces. The resistance within the nation was described as disorder rather than courage. Truth, he realized, had not disappeared. It had been edited. Legends soon followed. Stories of heroism grew exaggerated with each retelling. Certain commanders were elevated to near mythical status. Their decisions were praised as brilliant, their mistakes reframed as bold risks. The public, exhausted by grief, welcomed these narratives. Legends were easier to carry than ambiguity. Monuments reinforced the myths. Stone statues depicted soldiers frozen in noble poses, untouched by fear or regret. Inscriptions promised honor and unity. They offered certainty in a world still searching for meaning. People visited these sites not to remember the past as it was, but to feel reassured about what it had become. Yet, beneath the surface of official memory, quieter echoes persisted. Veterans gathered in small circles, sharing stories that did not match the textbooks. Families preserved letters that contradicted public accounts. Local historians documented events the capital refused to acknowledge. These fragments of truth survived not through institutions, but through stubborn remembrance. Elias became part of that resistance, not with weapons, but with testimony. He spoke at universities, community halls, and private gatherings. He refused to simplify. When asked who the heroes were, he named ordinary soldiers. When asked who the villains were, he resisted easy answers. Power, he argued, was rarely worn by monsters alone. It was sustained by systems, silence, and convenience. Some listened. Others accused him of undermining unity. The government responded with subtle pressure. Invitations were withdrawn. Funding for independent research vanished. Elias was not arrested. Doing so would draw attention, but he was slowly pushed to the margins. History, after all, prefers cooperation. Over time, even truth-tellers began to fade. Elias aged, witnesses passed away, letters deteriorated, memory weakened. What survived was what had been recorded, and what had been recorded was shaped by those who held authority at the time. This was how truth transformed. First, facts were selected. Then, context was removed. Finally, meaning was reassigned. A defensive maneuver became a heroic stand. A massacre became collateral damage. A resistance movement became unrest. The process was gradual, almost invisible, and because it unfolded over generations, few noticed it happening. Students learned dates without causes, names without stories, victory without cost. Yet, every so often, the past resurfaced. A newly discovered journal, a recovered battlefield photograph, a declassified order that contradicted the official timeline. Each revelation sparked brief controversy, followed by silence. The world had moved on. Reopening old wounds was considered unnecessary, even dangerous. But the wounds were never closed. They lived on in families who never learned the truth about how their loved ones died, in communities erased from maps, in veterans who could not reconcile their experiences with the stories they were told to celebrate. The question lingered: who owns history? Is it written by victors because they are right, or because they remain standing long enough to decide? Is truth what can be proven, or what can be preserved? And what happens to a society that mistakes comfort for honesty? Elias addressed these questions in his final public lecture. He spoke slowly, aware that time had become his enemy. He reminded his audience that history was not a monument, but a conversation, that every generation had a responsibility to question what it inherited. Legends, he said, are not lies by nature. They become lies when they replace truth instead of pointing toward it. He did not ask for statues, he asked for curiosity. After his death, Elias Mercer became a symbol himself, ironically simplified, occasionally misquoted. Some remembered him as a hero, others as a troublemaker. A few tried to erase him entirely. History repeated its pattern. Yet, somewhere between lies and legends, fragments of truth endured. They existed in the questions people continued to ask, in the discomfort that arose when official stories felt too neat, in the understanding that history, like power, must be examined constantly, or it will distort itself beyond recognition. The echoes of the past never truly fade. They change shape. They wait.
Legacy of blood and hope. Why this story still matters today. History does not end when the last cannon falls silent or when treaties are signed. It echoes forward, shaping the present in ways both visible and hidden. The wars, betrayals, and sacrifices that once tore empires apart remain alive, not in monuments or textbooks alone, but in the moral and emotional fabric of societies that survive them. The empire that had once seemed invincible now existed largely in memory and cautionary tales. Cities were rebuilt, governments reorganized, and armies downsized. Borders, once contested with blood, were redrawn on maps. Yet the lessons of the past were far from settled. Elias Mercer, though long gone, had left a subtle but enduring mark. His efforts to speak truth, preserve stories of the forgotten, and honor human dignity became a foundation for reflection across generations. The people who once marched beside him, the soldiers, civilians, and quiet resistors, had vanished physically, but their resilience lived on. They were the embodiment of hope born in the darkest of times. In the present day, that hope manifests in ways both direct and symbolic. Nations study past conflicts, not just to glorify conquest, but to understand the cost of power untempered by ethics. Military academies analyze Greyhaven, not just for strategy, but for the human errors and moral compromises that led to catastrophe. History lessons now emphasize empathy alongside tactics. Yet the most profound lessons are personal. Families of those long dead carry invisible scars, yet they also inherit stories of courage, mercy, and sacrifice. Ordinary citizens, reading journals, letters, and records salvaged from the past, find inspiration to resist injustice in their own lives. The echoes of lost voices, carefully preserved, remind society that vigilance is necessary and compassion essential. America, in particular, can draw deeply from this history. The ideals of freedom, accountability, and moral responsibility are fragile. They are constantly tested by power, fear, and the allure of convenience. Modern leaders, citizens, and institutions can forget that decisions made in haste or for expediency often leave human costs unseen until it is too late. The story of Greyhaven and the countless unseen sacrifices serves as both warning and guide. Honor and power are meaningless if they erase humanity. Across the world, the legacy resonates as well. Conflicts continue, leaders rise and fall, and ordinary people still bear the weight of decisions beyond their control. Yet the historical record, even when incomplete or biased, provides perspective. It reminds society that victories achieved at the cost of conscience are hollow, and that collective memory is a tool for justice, empathy, and moral reflection. Art, literature, and media carry these lessons further. Films depict the unseen struggles of soldiers. Books tell the stories of civilians in conflict zones, and exhibitions preserve relics that evoke both grief and admiration. Audiences are confronted with questions. How do we honor the fallen without exploiting them? How do we prevent history from repeating its cruelties? How do we balance power with principle? These questions are particularly pressing in an age dominated by rapid information, social media, and globalized perspectives. Truth is as contested today as it ever was. Misinformation spreads, narratives are manipulated, and voices are silenced. The past, as remembered and misremembered, provides a mirror. It forces societies to confront the cost of inaction, of believing convenient lies, or of allowing legends to replace truth. Elias's warnings, delivered decades before, echo louder now. Legends become lies when they obscure the realities that matter most. He reminds us that history is not just a set of events. It is the responsibility of every generation to question, record, and act with awareness. Those who endured conflict, those who resisted silently, those who survived Greyhaven or marched unseen, they matter because remembering them safeguards our collective humanity. The legacy is not merely about mourning what was lost, it is also about celebrating what endured. Courage, empathy, and moral integrity are threads that persist even when institutions falter. Communities that rebuilt after destruction, families who protected truth against propaganda, individuals who acted despite fear. These examples illuminate paths for modern societies navigating ethical dilemmas, political upheaval, and moral uncertainty. In American society today, the echoes of these stories manifest in civic engagement, social justice movements, and the continued questioning of power structures. Citizens who examine history critically become participants in shaping a nation that values truth and compassion over expedience and propaganda. Veterans and active service members honor the principle that service is not mere obedience, but a commitment to preserving humanity amid conflict. Moreover, the story challenges us to recognize the forgotten in our midst. Every society has its Greyhavens, places where sacrifice is invisible, courage unrecognized, and suffering silenced. Acknowledging them requires deliberate effort, listening, documenting, and acting with moral clarity. To ignore them is to risk repeating mistakes that history has already borne witness to. The lessons extend into the personal sphere as well. Families, educators, and individuals are encouraged to confront uncomfortable truths. How do we respond when authority conflicts with conscience? How do we honor those whose contributions society overlooks? How do we measure success when lives, dignity, and trust are at stake? These questions are timeless, bridging the past and the present, connecting the legacies of empires with the responsibilities of ordinary citizens today. Ultimately, the story of blood and hope emphasizes a fundamental truth. Victory is not measured by borders won, enemies defeated, or power preserved. Victory is measured by the preservation of humanity amid the chaos of ambition and fear. When that humanity survives, even partially, it offers a foundation upon which a more just and compassionate society can be built. As the world continues to face conflict, inequality, and moral challenges, remembering the lessons of Greyhaven, the march of the forgotten, and the resistance within a divided nation becomes not just an academic exercise, but a civic imperative. These stories illuminate the cost of choices, the fragility of power, and the enduring strength of ordinary people who acted with courage and conscience. For American audiences, and for humanity at large, the story remains relevant because it confronts the eternal tension between power and principle. It reminds us that each generation inherits not only the triumphs of the past, but also its failures, omissions, and silences. How we respond determines whether history becomes a chain of repeated mistakes or a guide for ethical and humane action. The echoes through time are clear. Power without accountability is fragile. Truth without vigilance is vulnerable. Sacrifice without remembrance is meaningless. And hope, no matter how small, endures. Elias Mercer and the countless unnamed soldiers, civilians, and resistors remind us that even when history tries to forget, the human spirit persists. Their legacy of blood, struggle, resilience, and courage is not confined to monuments or dusty tomes. It lives in the questions we ask, the decisions we make, and the society we strive to create. The past is never truly past. It shapes the present, guides the future, and challenges us to live with awareness, empathy, and moral courage.